Hello and welcome to this recorded version of my inaugural talk at the PTS-Network's new seminar series on early career research in proof-theoretic semantics. My name is Sophie Nagler. I'm a PhD student at the RK Research Center of the University of St Andrews and the Institute for Logic, Language and Computation at the University of Amsterdam. In this talk, I will be pursuing two aims. Firstly, I want to show you a new way of doing proof-theoretic semantics, which I call inference behavior semantics. And then the second step, I want to show you how inference behavior semantics works in practice by giving semantics for all connectives in two-dimensional sequent calculi. Now, before we get started, let's look a little bit at some background motivation for this project. Now, when we're doing semantics, we're concerned with meaning. So a suitable starting point for doing semantics might be asking a question like this: when do two expressions mean the same? Now, we're not concerned with just any expression, but specifically with the logical connectives, at least for the purposes of this talk. So we will be asking, when do two logical connectives mean the same? Now, proof-theoretic semantics standard answer to that question is that of inferentialism. That means two connectives mean the same if and only if we use them in the same way when we do inferences with them. So we use them the same way when we reason with them. Something that might be nicely captured by Wittgenstein's famous dictum, meaning as use. But how can we tell that we use two connectives in the same fashion? Well, here proof-theoretic semantics gives a molecularist answer. It tells us, look at the proof rules. They'll tell you how the connectives are used. This idea can be traced to Gentzen's notion of the connective rules as definitions of the connective. But here's a little bit of a gap in the story, right? How did we just get from the proof rules to the use? Or maybe asked differently, what is it about the proof rules that actually gives us the use? I'll call this little gap in the explanation we've given the rule-use gap. And we'll be concerned with filling this gap for the remainder of the talk. Now, if you delve into the literature and see what have people said about how to get from the proof rules to the use, or what about the proof rules gives us the use, you'll find that there isn't a whole lot on this out there. Maybe the best place we could look is Greg Restall's work on proof-theoretic logical pluralism. Here he tries to carry over his 2006 model-theoretic logical pluralism, together with Beale, into the realm of proof theory. And as part of that work, Restall formulates what people later on call the sameness thesis. And the sameness thesis seems to be a suitable candidate for filling the rule-use gap. It tells us that two connectives mean the same if and only if the operational rules have the same active formulae in the same spots. So what about the proof rules is it that gives us connective use? It's the active formulae of the rules. Now let's look at an example. We'll be looking at sequent calculus formulations of proof rules in this talk. And so here we can have a look at the classical and the intuitionistic connectives, Gentzen's classical LK and Gentzen's intuitionistic LJ. And as it turns out, according to sameness, classical and intuitionistic connectives will have the same meaning. How come? Look here, for example, at the conditional rules for LK first and then for LJ. Or we could just use any other connective, and we'll see those rules have the same active formulae, right? So LK rule has in the first premise an A on the right, a B on the left, and the left LJ rule has an A on the right in the first premise and a B on the left in the second premise. Similarly, for the right rule, we have an A on the left and a B on the right in the one premise of that rule, and in the case of LJ, the same thing holds, right? So not only do we have the same active formulae, but they're also in the same spots. By the same spots, we mean they're on the same side of the sequence symbol, which we use a single turnstile for in our notation here. So the active formulae are the same. and the spots of the active formulae are also the same. The only thing that differs between the LK and the LJ rules is their contexts. In the case of LK, we have unrestrained context. LK sequences are defined on multisets, meaning they're binary derivability relations from unconstrained multisets on the left, so multisets of any arbitrary cardinality on the left, and multisets of arbitrary cardinality on the right. So gamma and delta are two such unspecified and unconstrained multisets. Now in the case of LJ, we do have the same space on the left of the sequence symbol, with space for an unconstrained multiset, but on the right, we only have space for at most one formula, so either a multiset of cardinality 0 or a multiset of cardinality 1. And the rules are adjusted appropriately, right? So here our delta is the empty set, because we only have space for the one active formula A. In the case of LJ, we don't have space for an unconstrained multiset pi, but our pi now is a single context formula, which we write as C, right? So we do have the same active formulae in the same spots, and the only difference we're dealing with is a difference with respect to the contexts. Now we'll be using slightly different notation to represent this, and as you'll see in a second, it will help us make the results of sameness even more immediately visible. The notation we'll be using is inspired by the work of Barthes, Fernmüller, and Zach on n-sided sequent calculi. And we'll be using three notational devices for our purposes. Firstly, we have a component-wise way of expressing sequence. So for a sequent between multiset phi and psi, we will be writing in the first component, we have all of the formulae in phi, and in the second component, we have all of the formulae in psi. So we just specify what's in the left and what's the right, and we'll call that the first and the second component of the sequent. Then secondly, we have a nice shortcut of writing arbitrary sequence. These are sequences where each of the lateralities, the first and the second component, just contain any arbitrary multisets, constrained only by what the calculus puts as constraints in place. And we'll be writing those with lowercase letters. So if you have a gamma implies delta sequent, we will be writing this just as a lowercase s, and then if you've got another sequent with other arbitrary contexts on the left and on the right, or arbitrary multisets on the left and on the right, we'll be writing that as lowercase t, so just picking another letter. And then thirdly, we have a device of combining those two notations, which is sequent multiplication. And the way you can think of this is as just writing on each component what's in each of the sequence. So if we have a comma gamma in one sequence, we could be writing first component a comma gamma and then second component delta, or we could just be writing gamma delta as an arbitrary sequence, so it's a lowercase s here, and then multiply that with a in the first component. So we're multiplying the sequent where a is in the first component, everything else is empty, because standardly everything else is empty unless we've specified it in a sequent. And then multiply that with an arbitrary context sequent, and we get a shortcut way of writing this relatively lengthy sequent on the left. Let's look at what this looks like in practice. So here we have the LK rules again, in the notation we've seen earlier with the active formulae in yellow and the contexts in pink. And you can see in our new notation now that the active formulae will be moved into this component-wise notation, whereas all of the contexts can be reduced to lowercase letters, right? Because this is an arbitrary sequent, gamma delta, and this arbitrary sequence sigma pi will be represented as t, and then we just multiply them, but we'll drop the multiplication sign moving forward. So the active formulae go in the component-wise notation, the contexts go into the arbitrary sequent notation, and then obviously we can also multiply a context where we get gamma, comma sigma, multiset symbol delta, comma pi, in an abbreviated version as s times t, lowercase, right? And even more trivial for the right hand side. Now what's really handy about this notation is that if we move back to our original example where we look at the classical LK and the intuitionistic LJ connectives, specifically here the conditional again, we can really clearly see that those two rules have the same active formulae in the same spots, because the same active formulae are just in the same component in our notation, as the corner brackets make clear. And the only thing that differs now very clearly are the contexts. And the contexts are written the same way. Why? Because the arbitrary contexts are constrained by the calculus, but that's kind of obscured by our notation. It's absorbed into our lowercase letter. So you can see very clearly that you've got the same active formulae in the same spots. Now, one might also be tempted to argue that multiplicative and additive connective rules have the same meaning. We use the right arrow for the multiplicative connective rules and the right squig arrow for the additive sister thereof. So again, we stick to the conditional for now. Now, if we look at the left row, it becomes very clear we've got the same active formulae once more. And the only thing that differs between the two rules are the contexts, right? In the case of the multiplicative rules, we've got differentiated contexts. So each of the premise sequence has different contextualizations of the active formula. And then we multiply those in the principal formula, the principal sequence, the conclusion sequence, pardon me. Whereas we have the shared context in each of the premise sequence, and then in the conclusion sequence, we only have one instance of that formula. But that doesn't bother us because the active formulae are the same, and hence, by sameness, we have the same meaning. One might be tempted to also extend this reasoning to the right rule, right? We have in the first component A and the second component B for the right arrow rule, and for the right squig arrow rule, we've got in the first component A and the second component B. And the only difference that's happening between the two is down to the contexts. However, not everybody might be happy with this argument. Why? Because there's a difference which formula is active at a time when we make an inference using the second component, the right arrow or right squig arrow rule respectively. Why? Because for the right arrow rule, A and B are both active at the same time. We have a single premise sequence, or we need to both have an instance of A and an instance of B in order to be allowed to infer using this rule the principal formula A right arrow B. Whereas in the case of the second component right squig arrow rule, we need to pick which of the two premise sequence we use. So we still have one premise sequence, but only one of the two active formulae is active at a time. So either we make the inference from A in the first component and go to A right arrow or right squig arrow B in the principal formula, or we start our inference in the second component with B, and then infer A right squig arrow B in the principal formula. So not both are active at the same time, but only one of them. However, note, the same reasoning didn't extend to our first component rule. So one thing we might want to do based on this is we might just want to keep the multiplicative rule in the second component, but move to the context sharing, the additive rule, in the first component. So this is a mixed connective, what we see here as the horseshoe connective, and that's called assorted in the terminology of Humberstone. And these assorted connectives consisting of the multiplicative right rule and the additive left rule aren't any kind of exotic creatures that you might be thinking about, but it's something you find quite frequently in logic textbooks, such as the Handbook of Proof Theory, Buzz's Handbook of Proof Theory. You'll find that in the standard definition of a sequent calculus. Now, as to why they have to do with proof search, we're not concerned with why you might want to use this connective over another one. What we are concerned with here is that very clearly, according to sameness, the two rules have the same meaning. The active formulae are in the same spots, are active at the same times, therefore, and they're the same, therefore they have the same meaning. However, as we'll see in just a second, this meaning equivalence, according to sameness, will get us into some trouble. Now, as proof-theoretic semanticists, we're very well aware that not just any operational rule pair successfully defines a connective. For example, if we take Prior's tonk in our notation, it will look like this. From B you get A tonk B in the first component, and from A in the second component, you'll get A tonk B in the second component, appropriately contextualized in each case. And as I'm sure most of the listeners will be aware of, if we add these rules to a reflexive and a transitive derivability relation, a reflexive and transitive sequent calculus, i.e. one with identity rules and cut rules, we'll realize, oh goodness, the system is trivialized. We can prove any formula from any formula. So typically, in order to gatekeep such pseudo-connectives such as tonk, we impose a definability test that any candidate connective has to pass. So kind of extra hoops for the connective to jump through, which is known under the concept of harmony. Now in this talk, we will be employing a notion of harmony that traces back to Emil Post and Noel Belknap, which consist of conservativity and uniqueness. So it will require our connectives, if added to a derivability relation, to result in a conservative and unique extension of that original derivability relation. We'll see both criteria in more detail later on. For now, let's focus on conservativity for a moment. Now, in a nutshell, conservativity tells us that if we add a candidate connective to a sequence system, then any new proofs that are constructable after the addition can't contain any new formulae unless they contain the connective we just added to the calculus using the connective rules. And the way you typically prove conservativity is via the subformula property and the presence of a transitive derivability relation, so in the presence of cut. That means you need to prove cut elimination. Now let's look at the cut elimination proof for the right arrow rules in a transitive and reflexive derivability relation. So derivability relation that is only characterized by a rule for cut and an identity axiom. At one point, as a part of this cut elimination proof, we will want to reduce the cut height or cut complexity over the principal formulae. And so we have a step like this that we would like to reduce. And in the case of the right arrow rules, this works just very much straightforwardly in the fashion you would expect. However, if we try to replicate the same thing for a horseshoe connective, for the assorted connective in the same context of derivability, cut identity, the equivalent proof fails. We can't reduce cut height or complexity over the principal formulae, and in fact cut elimination as a whole fails. Now we said harmony is a test for definability. This means what we've just seen is that the right arrow connective can be defined in the context cut identity, the structural context cut and identity, whereas the assorted connective cannot be defined in cut and identity. This means we can reason with the right arrow rule in cut and identity because it's definable, but we can't reason. We can't make inferences with the assorted connective rule in cut and identity. Hence, we have two rules which have the same active formulae in the same spots, and according to sameness, they should have the same meaning. But we have different inferential use. So there seems to be some sort of clash between the inferentialism component of our account and Restor's sameness thesis. Why is this so? Well, we could diagnose it this way. The right arrow and the horseshoe connectives require different structural rules for meaningful definability. We used a context differentiating version of cut, so we have in the two where you have in the two premise sequence different context sequence. But the assorted connective can't be defined in a context consisting of context differentiating cut and identity. Instead, we would need to use context sharing cut. So cut, we have in each of the premise sequence the same context sequence. Alternatively, we could also use context differentiating cut, but then add additional contraction rules. But as we all know, context differentiating cut and context sharing cut, or context differentiating cut by itself and context differentiating cut with contraction rules, prove different theorems. And hence, those structural rules have very different inferential use, very different kind of reasoning we can do with it. So it seems quite natural that we reason, that we make different inferences with the right arrow and the horseshoe rule. And as an upshot, right arrow and horseshoe can't have the same meaning according to inferentialism, and still sameness claims they do. This phenomenon is what Bogdan Dicher calls the codetermination thesis in his 2016 paper on meaning-invariant logical pluralism. Some structural properties, according to this thesis, co-determine the way we use connectives, right? And this shows something is fishy with sameness. Sameness doesn't seem to be in a position to tell us the full story, to fill this explanatory gap, the rule use gap that we started off with, in a satisfactory fashion. So what now? Seems like we're back to square one. We're trying to fill the rule use gap. Or are we? Now I believe we can turn this apparent bug into a feature of a proof-theoretic semantics. That's the core of the approach, which I call inference behavior semantics, and which I want to introduce you to in this talk. The main idea is measure which parameters of the proof rules determine the way we use connectives. So instead of trying to find a top-down stipulated definition that tells us, oh, this is doing the action, we're just doing a bottom-up approach. So we're looking at what actually affects use, and then from that we get to the proof-theoretic semantic clauses, namely the rules that are defined only by those parameters that determine connective use. And here comes a little bit of a plot twist. We'll only look at those that minimally determine connective use. So only at those rule parameters that are just strong enough to get the kind of use of the connective we want. And the resulting rules, that's our proof-theoretic semantic clause for, say, a connective or any other kind of logical operator. That's the basic idea behind this. If you want to summarize it in a slogan, our slogan is meaning as minimal use. Now, for the remainder of this talk, we'll be looking at how inference behavior semantics works in practice, and that way you'll hopefully see what this approach is after. And specifically, we'll be looking at a very broad case study. Namely, we'll be giving inference behavior semantics for just any connective we can define in two-dimensional sequent calculi. Two-dimensional sequent calculi, those are calculi based on a binary derivability relation between finite multisets of formulae. So this is the standard sequent calculus as you're used to it. And this should subsequently cover the connectives in a whole lot of very familiar calculi, such as classical LK, intuitionistic LJ, duo-intuitionistic LDJ, Gensen's minimal logic, LM, or lattice logic, LAL, and a bunch of related substructural and relevant logic systems. So how will we achieve this goal? First, we'll sketch a general recipe how you can build yourself your own inference behavior semantics. And then in the second step, we'll be putting this into action. So I'll be walking you through a concrete measurement of all of the meaning determining parameters for all of the connectives in two-dimensional sequent calculi. We'll start with the general design of how we set up this test of meaning. Then in a second step, I'll show you how to generate the relevant data that you do the measurement in. And then the fifth step, we do the actual measurement. We analyze the data and see what are the meaning determining parameters. And then I'll show you all of the results for all of the connectives in two-dimensional sequent calculi. And then finally, we'll assess the results as to whether they achieve the goals we're after by looking at some intriguing implications of them. And maybe that way you'll see if you're also interested in working with this inference behavior semantics based approach. So let's start off with a general recipe how to make ourselves inference behavior semantics. Remember, the main idea was we want to measure what rule parameters minimally determine the way we use connectives. Now, in order to do this measurement, we'll need ingredients 3. Firstly, we'll need a connective as it's defined by its operational rules. And I will be using hash as a general symbol for the for any arbitrary connective we're talking about. Secondly, we'll need to look at a list of candidate row parameters that could potentially determine the use of the connective. P1 to Pn, just a list. And then thirdly, we'll need a context where we can carry out this measurement in, and this context, as I said earlier, needs to give us the minimal use, so itself needs to be minimal. And by context we mean the structural setting, the derivability relation that we conduct the measurement in. So we'll need a minimal derivability relation, and I'll come back to each of those three in more detail later on. Our derivability relation in a sequent calculus is our sequent symbol, right? It's the turnstile we've been using. So what properties this turnstile satisfies. And now that we've got all our ingredients at hand, let's look at what the measurement process looks in detail. Let's make the actual semantics. A nice way of representing this is in form of a very simple algorithm. So in the first step, we'll take our candidate connective hash as it's defined by its operational rules, and we'll add it to a derivability relation, so to a sequent calculus consisting of the relevant structural rules. And then in the second step, we show that we can actually define hash in that minimal derivability relation. So we prove harmony. We prove, in our case, conservativity and uniqueness of that extension. Now we go over the proofs we just did and tag every hash formula and its specific location where it occurs in the proof. We'll use those inferential locations, inferential positions of the hash formula to keep track of what will be the independent variable of the measurement, i.e. the inferential use of the connective, right? Because we want to figure out what parameters determine use, if we've got to keep use constant, and vary the parameters to see which ones affect the use. Now in the next step, we go back to our original hash rules, and we'll go to the first parameter on a list of parameters, and we'll restrict that parameter about the hash rules. And now we rinse and repeat. So we add the restricted hash rules to our minimal derivability relation. We redo the proof of definability. We go over the proof and again tag all of the hash formulae and their locations to keep track of the inferential use of that formula. And now we compare and contrast. Now, if the hash formula locations in the restricted rules and the corresponding proof are different to those in the proof done with the unrestricted rules, we have a change of locations of hash formulae, hence a change of use, because remember, the locations of the hash formulae are our metric for inferential use. But if we have a change of inferential use, we have, according to inferentialism, a change of meaning. Now, if the restriction by the parameter did lead to a change of meaning, the restricted rules and the corresponding parameter are irrelevant to us because we want to find the rules that give the minimal use of the original connective. If there is a change of meaning, we don't care. Therefore, we'll go back up to step 5 and undo the restriction we just did, returning to the original rule. However, if we don't have a change of meaning, if the locations and hence the use stays the same, we'll just keep the restriction in place. Either way, we continue to our next parameter on the list, and we do the same thing again. We restrict the proof rule according to that parameter, we add it to the minimal derivability relation, we prove definability, we tag the locations of hash formulae, and we evaluate. If the locations are different, we undo the restriction, because we're not concerned with a change of meaning, we only care about those connectives that retain the meaning, those restricted connectives that retain the meaning, and then we just continue to the next parameter and we go through it until we've exhausted our list of row parameters. That's what we do here. Now if we've set up our list of row parameters cleverly, going from the strongest parameters to the weakest parameters, we should have actually terminated by the end of this process at exactly a row that gives the same use still as the original connective, unless we've made a mistake, but is much more minimal than the original row, and in fact should be the most minimal one if we've done the right way of setting up our row parameters list. Now if we look at the row for the hash, the ultimately restricted hash connective in the end, this should give us the minimal row parameters because it's only defined by the minimal row parameters, and as that it should be the proof-theoretic semantic clause of the connective. It should be the rows that tell us exactly what the minimal use of the connective looks like. Now this was all very fast, so let's go through the same thing again, just much more slowly. So let's start by walking through the design of our test at first. We said earlier that we need 3 ingredients for inference behavior semantics. First, we need a connective as defined by its operational rule. Specifically for our case study, as we said we're after, we want to look at the operational rules defining connectives, which can be defined in 2-dimensional sequent calculi and have at most 2 premise sequence and at most 2 active formulae. Now this first constraint here, the definability in 2-dimensional sequent calculi, this is a hard constraint. Expanding this method to higher dimensional sequent calculi, 3-dimensional sequent calculi, 4-dimensional sequent calculi, i.e. 3 4-sided sided sequent calculi you sometimes say, isn't quite straightforward. So if you have a 3-sided calculus for LP for instance, or you've got a 4-sided sequent calculus for FDE for instance, it's not quite straightforward how we can extend the method, and that's something for future research. However, the second and the third constraint here, they are merely pragmatic. We'll limit ourselves to at most 2 premise formulae and at most 2 active premise sequence and at most 2 active formulae in order to limit the length of our investigation. Expanding this method to more than 2 premise sequence, more than 2 active formulae in the proof rules should be relatively straightforward. It's merely pragmatic that we don't do it, and you should be in a position to do this yourself after watching this talk. However, for our purposes here and for the results we want to discuss in the end, this restriction is completely adequate, as most interesting cases of connectives will be covered even with those 2 restrictions in place. If you paid attention earlier, we said we want to look at all connectives definable in 2-dimensional sequent calculi, and we've put a cheeky little asterisk after the all. And here's what the asterisk means, right? We have those 2 restrictions in place, the pragmatic restriction and the hard restriction of definability in 2-dimensional sequent calculi. That's what we mean by all connectives. All right, so what do those connective rules, those operational rules, look like? Well, in general, we can characterize operational rules in terms of 1, their premise type. That means which active formulae occur where in how many premise sequence. Secondly, the framework, so how much space we've got on each side of the sequence symbol. Think of LK, think of LJ for instance. And then thirdly, which arity does the principal formula have? So are we dealing with a nullary connective, with a unary connective like negation, a binary connective like disjunction, and so on. Let's start off by looking at the different options we have for the premise types, and this is the most complicated part of this definitional exercise. Now in general, rules can take 3 shapes: alpha, beta, and gamma. Alpha means we have less than 1 premise sequent in our operational rule. Beta means we have less than 2 premise sequence in our operational rule. And gamma means that we've got exactly 2 premise sequence in our operational rule. Now alpha, beta, and gamma tell us about how many premise sequence we have. P, which is the position as a part of the premise type, SCP, shape, position, refers to the position of the active formulae. So this tells us we have 0 active formulae in our premise sequence, we have one active formula, f, in position I, or we've got two active formulae, f and g, in position I and j, respectively. Because we only look at most two active formulae, we pick our f's and our g's from the set of formula A, formula B, which you could then use to build up our principal formula from. So this is either A in position I or B in position I, and I is just in the first or the second component. So you have A in the first component, A in the second component if f is A and I is 1 and 2 respectively, and here similarly you can have A in the first component, A in the second component, A in the first component, B in the second component, B in the first component, A in the second component, and so on. And this is what we express using the position. Now we can make a third distinction, which is represented by the C, standing for contextualization. So for example, if we look at rules of shape gamma, we can have 0 active formulae. So we have an arbitrary sequent, just consisting of context, so to say, in one premise sequent, and another different arbitrary set of formulae, multi-set of formulae on each side of the other premise sequent. This would be contextualized in a context differentiating way, right? We've got different context formulae. We could also define the same rule using a context sharing definition. So we have the same context in each of the premise sequence. Why I refer to them as context becomes clear if you look at not the case with 0 active formulae, but for instance the case with 2 active formulae. So if in the left premise sequent, formula f in position I, contextualized in the same way as this other premise sequent, which is in position where the active formula is in position G, but you've got the same context sequent in the context sharing case, but different context sequence in the context differentiating case. Now, we distinguish context sharing and context differentiating here in the context of setting up these rules from the term additive and multiplicative, because by additive and multiplicative we mean what we've seen earlier when we talked about the additive and the multiplicative, conditional in the context of LK, for example. By multiplicative rules, we mean rules where, say in the 2 premise sequence case, you need to have both of the premise sequence present at the same time, whereas in the additive case, you need to pick which of the two active formulae is present in the one premise sequence at any given time, which one is active at any given time. And here comes into play what I meant earlier with less than 2, right? Because here you've got one premise sequence, and here you've got to pick between one premise sequence. You can have 1.5 premise sequence. That's maybe a good way of thinking about it. And in this row, you pick between either a premise sequence with an active formula or a premise sequence that just has the context. And then in the case of alpha, you have again an additive version, or you simply have an axiomatic connective rule. So from the antiset, infer your connective. Or in the additive version, either you infer your connective from the empty set, so you infer it as an axiom, or you infer it from from just context, or a contextualized single active formula in position I. Right? This might be a little confusing to get your mind around it first, so let's try to make it a bit clearer using an example. So here we've got the premise type of fusion that is multiplicative conjunction. And that will be a running example moving forward, multiplicative and additive conjunction. Now, multiplicative conjunction has a left row with one premise sequent, where you've got the active formula A on the left of the sequence symbols in the first component, and the formula B in the left component. So if you were writing this as a traditional sequence, you would have A, comma B on the left side of the turnstile in one premise sequence. And that's a multiplicative rule because both need to be active at the same time. It's A, comma B, not A or B, for instance. And in the case of the right rule, we have a 2 premise sequence right rule, where you've got A on the left and J on the right. And because we're in the case of fusion, we have a context differentiating version of this rule, which means the 2 premise sequence in the right row have different contextualizations. So this just means you've got an inference of A, you've got an inference of B, therefore you've got an inference of A fusion B, of A and B, right? That's exactly what we want this matrix to output all of the connectives we know, plus maybe even more possible combinations. And similarly, you can define the row pair for meet. Meet is the additive version of conjunction. Now the only difference is very simply expressed by going from a multiplicative left row to an additive left row. So instead of having both active at the same time, you've got one active at a time in this row. So if you base an inference on A, you can base it on A and B. Or if you base it on B, you can base it on A and B. That's what it tells us. And here again, if you have an inference of A and you've got an inference of B and they're contextualized in the same way, the contexts are shared, then you have an inference of A and B in the second component. This is what the premise type for meet tells us. All right, this matrix should hopefully become a little clearer now. That's our premise type SCP, shape contextualization position, of the active formulae and the premise sequence. That should be done. Cool. Let's look at the framework, the second component to characterizing operational rows. And the framework is a lot more straightforward. It just tells us how much space we've got on each side of the sequence symbol, how much space we've got in each component of our sequence. So which cardinality do the multi-set of formulae on the left and on the right have, respectively. Should become even clearer if you just look at some examples. We write it L:R, where each of those tells us from which set of cardinalities we can draw on the left and on the right, respectively. So in the case of LK, we can of course draw on unrestricted cardinality on each side of the sequence symbol because our multisets are unrestricted, so we can draw from the natural numbers for our cardinality on the left and the natural numbers for the cardinality on the right, and in each case we also can pick 0 because we can in fact have an empty sites, an empty multiset on each side, the empty set on each side. Now we move to LJ by keeping our left side of the sequence unrestricted, and on the right side of the sequence we can now only pick between cardinality 0 and cardinality 1, so at most one formula on the right. LDJ is the duo intuitionistic logic. That's LDJ. So we just do a flip and we get at most one formula on the left and we've got unrestricted cardinality on the right. In the case of LM, Johnson's minimal logic, we need to have exactly one formula on the right. So we can only draw from cardinality 1 on the right, but we keep the left unrestricted. Or in the case of LL, this is Resto and Paoli's lattice logic, not linear logic, lattice logic, where we can pick from at most cardinality 1 on the left and at most cardinality 1 on the right to compose our respective multisets. Now we can tie all of those components together in the form of a quintuple with which we can now characterize just any connective definable in two-dimensional sequence calculi with the pragmatic restrictions we mentioned earlier. So we specify what premise type does the first component, the left row, have, what premise type does the right row have, the right component, we've seen that earlier, what arity does the principal formula have, nullary, unary, binary, ternary connective, and how much space have we got on the left and on the right of the sequence symbol. So what's our framework like? In this way we can now characterize any connectives such as fusion, the left and the right premise type, we've seen that earlier. It's a binary connective, so the principal formula is binary. And we're in LK, for instance, so we've got unrestricted cardinalities. Or in the case of LK meet, you have unrestricted cardinalities again, a binary connective, but you need to adjust the premise types on the left and on the right accordingly to go from fusion to meet. Great, so we've now seen a very modular way to define all of the operational rows for all of the connectives we're interested in our two-dimensional sequence calculus settings. Now, what we need next is to look at how many there are. And in fact, if you run through all of the possible combinatorics, you'll get 5,329 operational row pairs you could define using this component-wise method. So there are 5,329 potential operational rule pairs definable in two-dimensional sequent calculi. So there's quite a bit of cases for us to consider, and as we'll see later on, reducing this number of cases will be one of the nice tricks we'll have to find our way around here. So now that we've got our 5,329 operational rule pairs at hand, we just need to find a list of all of the potential parameters that could determine use in those rules. And here's the good news, we've already done the work, because we'll just define our rule parameters according to the different components that make up the rules as we've just seen them. So we start our list by listing all of the potential premise shapes in the first component, then all of the potential premise shapes in the right component. Then we continue by listing all of the potential contextualizations in the first component, and then all of the potential contextualizations in the right component. Then we walk through all of the positions of the active formulae in the first and the second component, all of those combinations. And then we walk through all of the possible assignments that we have for the f and g variables of the actual meta variables of the active formulae we want to look at. So f and g could be a, f could be a, but g could be b. So this could be either 1a, 1g, if we have that assignment, or it could be 1a, 1b. Sorry, I meant 1a, 1a in the first case, and then 1a, 1b in the second case. And then finally, and here we need to be a bit more careful, we'll go through all of the frameworks. And because we need to go from the most maximal to the most minimal framework available, we'll start off with unrestricted contexts on each side and go down all the way to one formula, one formula, empty set, one formula, empty set, right? So we boil down. Let me just drag myself out of the picture so you can see what's over there. Lovely. And then last but not least, we'll go through the arity that the principal formula could take, starting again with unrestricted arity. So you've got an n-ary connective. Is that something we're concerned with? Going down and down and down to arity 2, binary connective, unary connective, nullary connective. Now you might have some qualms about infinity here, right? Because the natural numbers are pretty big. But as we'll see in a second, actually, this constraint won't really affect the results of this measurement process. So now we have our list of operational rules, and we have a list of all of the rule parameters that could potentially influence connective use. Now let's consider our minimal derivability relation. And let's maybe do this by taking a step back and asking ourselves, why do we want a minimal derivability relation? Why do we say meaning is minimal use? Now, a good way of making this clear is an argument by analogy. Let's consider our connectives to be somewhat like animals. In that case, our role as semanticists is equivalent to the role of a zoologist. Now, zoologists sometimes want to study their animals in their natural habitat. They want to look at which animals do they interact with, how do they interact with their environment, whom do they play with, what's going on in the big picture. Similarly here, as semanticists, we are sometimes also interested in the big picture. We're interested in how do our connectives behave in the full logical calculus, which other connectives do they interact with and in what fashion, how do they interact with properties of the derivability relation of our full calculus, right? But sometimes zoologists are also interested in questions of this kind. Is animal 1 the same animal as animal 2, right? In this case, zoologists ask about the species of the connective. Now, if we're doing science and we want to investigate a specific question, the way we do this typically is by means of experiment, right? So one way we could go about this is take our two animals, isolate them from their respective environments. Let's assume they're in separate habitats. And let's put them instead into a controlled testing environment, something like a laboratory enclosure. And now in this environment, let's run some tests. We could measure physiology. Let's just be pure behaviorists here and say we only sit down with a notebook and observe how do our two animals behave. If they behave in the same way, they eat the same way, they show the same kind of playing behavior, and so on, we will classify them as being of the same species. Equivalently, sometimes as semanticists, we ask questions of this kind. Does classical implication mean the same as intuitionistic implication? Now, when we ask those questions, we ask about the species of the connective or the meaning of the connective. And maybe we should also determine this by means of experimental measurement. So we should isolate each of those two connectives. We should put them in a controlled testing environment and then see if they're the same species, if they have the same meaning. They should show the same inferential behavior. They should act in the same way. They should be used in the same way. So we want to focus on how to get this derivability relation, this controlled testing environment where we get rid of all of the possible confounders that might get in the way of our measurement. So how shall we design our derivability relation? Well, we want to see meaningful inferential behavior. We don't just want to stare at static rules. We actually want to see some actual behavior, some actual use of the connective. But at the same time, we don't want to think about all of the potential confounders that go into this picture. So we don't want to be concerned with questions how our connective interacts with the structural properties of the derivability relation, or how our connective interacts with other connectives. We really want to minimize the accidentally measuring other aspects of the calculus rather than just the meaning, the use of our connective. So what we want is, we want a minimal derivability relation that is as minimal as it gets without losing functionality, without becoming unable to do any proofs in it. All right. Now, in general, if we look again back at scientific test design, we should be adopting a kind of pluralism about a minimal derivability relation. In science, the way we design our experiments varies vastly and mostly depends on pragmatic desiderata. You know, sometimes it's just an availability restriction, but sometimes we want to design experiments in a specific fashion because we want to replicate results that have been that were results of previous experiments which have been run according to a certain experimental design, and we're just replicating this experimental design. Similarly here, I think when we do our measurements of meaning, we should mostly be concerned with pragmatic desiderata. Now, in our case, I think a very pragmatic pick for a testing environment for a minimal derivability relation is a environment only defined by the two rules of cut, specifically context differentiating cut, and identity over primitives. Now, identity over primitives is, we only pick to make our proofs a bit easier because in all of the contexts we're concerned with full identity, so identity over formulae of arbitrary complexity is derivable. Now, those two are maybe considerable as adaptive choices for a minimal derivability relation for three reasons. Firstly, cut and identity are part of most of the interesting calculi, such as classical and intuitionistic logic, which we might be concerned with. So this is a function of how comparable our results will be. If we want to talk about some of these interesting calculi containing both of those connectives, both of those rules, it might be adaptive for us to also include them into a minimal derivability relation. Now, secondly, they satisfy our constraint of having a functioning relation. Why? Because we can actually start our proofs. We've got an axiom. That's great. Our proof trees, our inverted proof searches terminate in leaves. And we've got a way of having the lateralities of our sequence interact, so we can actually see some interesting things about the two sides, the left and the right rule of the connective. Now, thirdly, these might be good candidates for minimality. It's actually not that straightforward to get rid of transitivity and of reflexivity of cut and identity in your proofs. Something that might be mirrored by cut and identity also being a somewhat minimal version of the Tarskian properties. And because some philosophers are very concerned with the Tarskian properties for philosophical reasons, they might also agree with us using a subset of the Tarskian properties for minimal derivability relation here. Great. So now we have our rules, we have our minimal parameters, and we have our minimal derivability relation. Now let's put everything together and put it into action. How do we generate the data for our measurement of meaning? Let's go back to our simple measurement algorithm we looked at earlier. We said we need to take our candidate connective as defined by its operational rules, add it to a minimal derivability relation, and then prove definability. We also said we'll be using a specific notion of definability, namely post-bound-up harmony, conservativity, and uniqueness to check for definability. Now, one thing we have to do is we have to take our candidate connective as defined by its operational rules, add it to the minimal derivability relation we defined just now, and then show that all newly provable sequents contain hash. So we can't prove anything unless it contains the connective we just defined. Since we have cut elimination, we show this through the subformula property by cut. So we can see the proof is very straightforward. It's a combination of a Gentzen and a Curry-Belknap style proof. Of course, we can't use the mix method here because we don't have weakening contraction present. Instead, we need to resort to proving things directly via cut. Now, the only issue we're dealing with, in fact, is that there are just a lot of connectives, a lot of candidate connectives we need to consider. Think back, we want to prove with maximum generality definability for all connectives possibly definable in two-dimensional sequent calculi. So there's a lot of different little algorithms we have to run through. This is made easier by some handy lemmas such as this one, which basically tells us that some of the potential options, some of the potential combinations of rules, left-right rules, frameworks and so on, just wouldn't work from the beginning, ab initio, and we can just skip that option. These little lemmas all exploit the minimality of the minimal derivability relation we have at hand, and just weed out some of the connectives that wouldn't work in the first place. And then the second step, we need to walk through all of the remaining options by hand. But even here, as is shown in this example, as it happens, this example is a generalized version of our fusion rows. We can still exploit some of the nice properties of our notation by replacing specific components with just variables and then looking at multiple recombinations of connectives at once and kind of proving things at one higher level of generality as we usually would using standard notation in structural proof theory. So there's still some nice little shortcuts to deal with, just the quantity of cases we have to work through. Now if we run the conservativity proof for all of the options that we saw earlier, all of those over 5,000 options, we will find that exclusively 76 of our candidate connectives meet the conservativity constraints. So we've already reduced our very many options to only 76 remaining candidate connectives. The list here isn't for you to look at in more detail, it's just here for dramatic effect. Now that's conservativity done. Now we have to take our 76 conservative options and see if we can also prove uniqueness for them. So we have to show that if we add the operational rules to our minimal derivability relation, the newly defined connective hash is the only connective that has the inferential role of hash. And we prove this via an interchangeability proof. So we show that if we have another connective natural, which is defined by the same operational rules, modulo just substituting the symbol hash for, a natural for hash, we can show for any sequent containing hash, that's why we use the fancy hash here, it symbolizes a formula containing the hash symbol. that we can substitute it with a natural formula, here the fancy natural, and vice versa, right? So in any context, a hash formula can be replaced in the same context by a natural formula, and vice versa. And you prove this relatively straightforwardly by proving horizontal interderivability. So we've got vertical interderivability we want to prove. We prove horizontal interderivability. So if you have a hash formula on the left of the sequent, you can have the natural formula on the right side of the sequent, and again vice versa, and then just cutting over this little theorem for each of the relevant cases using our context differentiating cut. So what we need to do is we need to walk through all of the proofs of horizontal interderivability to then get the more general vertical interderivability out of that. And here again we exploit our notation by replacing the specific components just with generalized variables and trying to prove things at as high of a level of generality as we can manage. So what do we find? We find that of these 76 conservative options for connectives, we now have 22 ones that are also unique. And here again, merely for dramatic effect, showing you the possible combinations in our notation. Great. So now we have the data, the definability proofs we need in order to measure connective use in those proofs. And hence we get the meaning given our inferentialist backdrop. Let's now go over this data, these proofs again, and measure meaning. So let's analyze our data. Remember, we now need to go over the proofs and take all of the locations of our hash formulae, which gives us the inferential use of the connective. Now we also call in this talk all locations of the hash formulae the inferential behavior of that connective hash. This is where our inference behavior semantics gets its name from. Also maybe think back to an analogy from zoological research practice where we said we want to measure the minimal inferential behavior in a minimal derivability relation in order to get the meaning, the species of the connective we're dealing with. Now, when our two formulae in the same location, then the same location if and only if they are in the same components or on the same side of the sequence symbol, and they're on the same proof step, in the same node, on the same spot of the respective proof tree. Or maybe expressed a bit more simply, they're in the same horizontal location, right, side of the sequence symbol, and the same vertical location, i.e. in the same proof step of our sequent calculus proof. If you want to express that again with a slogan, you could call it use as behavior. We measure inferential use via the inferential behavior, the locations of the formulae. So now we go back to our proofs and we tag all of the inferential behavior of the connective we've done the proof for. And then we rinse and repeat and go through the remainder of the algorithm. So we restrict one component of the proof rule. We then prove definability, and in this proof we observe inferential behavior by tagging the inferential locations, and we then compare and go through the algorithm as we said. If inferential behavior is the same, we undo the restriction. Sorry, if the inferential behavior is different, we've got a change of meaning, we undo the restriction and move on, or otherwise directly move on to the next parameter and go through until we've exhausted a list of parameters. And by the end, we should get the minimal connective row defined by the minimal row parameters that determine the use and hence meaning of that connective, the minimal inferential behavior. This is the proof-theoretic semantic clause of our connective, just equivalent to model-theoretic semantic clauses as we're used to them. So let's look at an example for a minimal rule. Here for our running example, we're now back to specific components right? Not just variables in lieu of components. For this rule, we're limited to the minimal framework now, the minimal framework that we can operate in without having a change of meaning of cardinality 1 or 2 on the left and cardinality 1 on the right. If we look at the conservativity proof, now with, again, specific components, we can see that we need this space on the left and we need this space on the right in order for the proof to function. And the same holds true for the uniqueness proof. As it turns out, unsurprising the way we set up our running example, fusion is a special case, a specific case of this general connective. Just that the F's are replaced by an A, the G's replaced by a B, and we've specified that we're dealing with a binary, not just an arbitrary arity connective, which is all kind of obscured in this fancy hash and fantasy natural, as we've seen it earlier. In contrast to this proof-theoretic semantic clause for fusion, the minimal rule for fusion, let's look at the minimal rule for meet, and we see, not only do we have a difference in premise type, we also have a difference in the minimal framework that we're operating in. And now we do the same for all of our options the way we've broken it down. So we start off with the general options, limited us to 76 options where conservativity holds, limited us to the few options that uniqueness holds, and then analyze the data for each of those accordingly. What results do we get out of this picture? What are the minimal parameters determining use and hence meaning? First, let's look at what parameters generally determine meaning for all of the different connectors you considered. Firstly, if we're changing premise shape of the premise sequence, we're having a change of meaning. If we're changing the contextualization of the premise sequence, we're having a change of meaning. And if we change the position of the active formulae in the premise sequence, we have a change of meaning. Same holds for framework changes. Framework changes come with changes of meaning. So if we change the available space we have on the left and the right of the sequent calculus to do our definability proofs in. Now we've seen what changes meaning, what determines connective meaning. What if the parameters doesn't or don't determine connective meaning? Well, it's firstly the arity of the principal formula. We've seen earlier with our minimal rule, right? The arity didn't matter. We just stipulated to get our specific fusion clause that we should have arity too, but actually the arity doesn't matter. You could have a nullary, unary, binary connective. The way we set it up, you could build in some restriction into our model, but I don't think there is a straightforward way of motivating that quite as easily. But again, there is some leeway and some pluralism going on here. Secondly, what exact active formula you have doesn't affect the meaning of the connective and the use as an intermediary. So whether your F is A or your F is B or your G is A or your G is B. So what do our results look like in detail? Remember, we started off with maximum generality. We considered just any connective we could possibly define in two-dimensional sequent calculi. And then not only do we find that each unique premise type results in a unique connective, and associatedly you've got a minimal framework for that, but you also find, more importantly, that we get pretty much all of the connectives people would talk about in the literature. And that I find a rather fascinating result. So for example, you get the nullary connectives. You get top and you get bottom, and a slightly fancier version of top and bottom. You get the unary connectives as we're used to them. You get negation and you get converse negation, each of them with the specific premise type and with their associated minimal framework. We get the multiplicative binary connectives. So you get fission, you get left arrow, you get right arrow, you get converse fusion, converse fission, you get fusion, you get inverse left arrow, you get inverse right arrow, and you get converse fusion. So exactly the connectives that people have already been talking about, each of them with their specific premise shape and a unique premise shape, only one for each of them, and an associated framework, which can vary quite a bit between the different connectives, but seems to mirror what we would expect. So the premise type of fusion is the dual of the premise type of fission, for instance. The premise type of converse fission is the dual of the premise type of converse fusion. So everything as you would expect it. Now you also get the same number and an analogous set of meaning different additive connectives. So you get join, you get left squig arrow, you get right squig arrow, additive implication and the left version thereof. You get converse join, you get meet, you get converse meet, and you get inverse left arrow and inverse right arrow. And you can see already there's a really nice parallelism between the multiplicative and the additive results, but the connectives are separate. Join isn't the same as disjunction, meet isn't the same as conjunction, squig arrow isn't the same as straight arrow. And so correspondingly, I'm using terminology from linear logics here, as you might have noticed, right? I'm talking about fusion and meet and fission and join instead of just conjunction or disjunction. Now you can of course stop the video and you can look at the different tables to see the specific minimal frameworks that are required by each of those connectives. But I think what might be more instructive is to dig a little deeper into the results by looking at some key implications. What does this tell us for the logics we typically work with? For our discussion, we'll focus on the LK family of sequent calculi of logics. That is sequent calculi that you can obtain from LK by restricting some of the structural parameters of the calculus, such as the framework or the structural rules that are available. So in the LK family, you've got calculi such as classical LK, intuitionistic LJ, dual intuitionistic LDJ, minimal logic, LM, lattice logic, LL, and as Ferrari and Olandelli show, you can also obtain a relevant logic from each of those calculi just by deleting the weakening rules. So we also have a set of relevant logics available. And there are many more calculi you can consider in the LK family, but we'll limit ourselves to these for the most part. Now, as a first feature of our inference behavior semantics, we can note that additive and multiplicative connectives for us have different meanings. As we've seen in the tables, they require different minimal frameworks for the definability proofs to succeed, but also they require different minimal structural rules in some cases, as we've seen in the beginning when we compared multiplicative implications, right implications need for context differentiating cut with the assorted connectives need for context sharing cut. The same holds for additive cut, for additive right arrow, so right squig arrow. Now this feature might be quite surprising to you if you are used to the model-theoretic way of viewing things, because in standard model-theoretic semantics we tend to conflate the additive and the multiplicative versions of the connectives. So additive and multiplicative and, or, and so on. But if you've ever worked with substructural logics, this might be not as surprising for you, as our results seem to track well with logical practice. For example, we can see that meet is definable in dual intuitionistic LDJ, but fusion isn't. Why? Because we don't have enough space on the left in LDJ to define fusion. And for join is definable in LJ, but isn't definable in LJ. Note, however, that each of the non-definable connectives have a framework which requires the dual calculus, to still define the calculus within it. So you can define fusion in LJ and you can define fission in LDJ. This means that when we say and in LJ, we are conflating meet and fusion, but in LDJ we limit ourselves to only meet, the meet meaning of end. And the duo is true for join and fission. So when we say or in LDJ, we're conflating the two aspects of meaning, which are the meaning of join and fission, but in LJ we only mean join. So in each case, and or have different meanings in LJ and LDJ, right? Because one includes one aspect of meaning, the other excludes. And or are semantically or meaning incompatible in our inference behavior semantics. Another interesting feature that might not be surprising to you is that any notion of the conditional, whether the left or the right conditional, whether additive or multiplicative, same for negation, is meaning incompatible with lattice logic. In fact, in lattice logic, only meet and join share aspects of meaning with the other connectives in the LK family. Now, if we look at the conditional in more detail, we'll see that in LJ we can only define right arrow. In LDJ we can only define right squig arrow, so only multiplicative and additive versions of the conditional. This means right arrow and right squig arrow, and correspondingly if then in LJ and if then LDJ, are fully meaning incompatible. This is an even stronger version of meaning incompatibility, as we've seen for disjunction and conjunction, where you only have an aspect of meaning shared and another one not shared between each of them. Here we have full meaning incompatibility. If you say if then and I say if then, we definitely don't mean the same. There isn't even overlap of the meanings we're using for if then. But hold on, says objector. You just said your notions of implication in LJ and LDJ are fully meaning incompatible. But you also say, or it follows at least from your tables, that classical implication shares meaning with both, right? In LK, we can define both right arrow and right squig arrow. This is a contradiction. Now, dearest gentle objector, you're suffering from a linguistic confusion. When we say classical implication, we don't mean a connective. Rather, we mean a connective, such as right arrow or right squig arrow, within a full strength derivability relation, such as LK, LJ, or LDJ. Think back to our analogy, right? Our connective is like an animal, our full calculus is like the habitat. If you're talking about classical implication, you're talking about the animal in the habitat, you're talking about the connective in the full logical calculus. Now, it is a feature of the logical calculus, i.e. of LK, that we conflate right arrow and right squig arrow. And it is a feature of LJ that one is definable but not the other. But the meaning of right arrow and right squig arrow is independent from the calculus it occurs in. It's given by the proof-theoretic semantic clause we've said earlier. So definability within calculi is a result of the interaction between our connective and our calculus, our full strength derivability relation, but not a function of the meaning of the connective that's definable or not. Yet still, our objector raises another point. In your minimal derivability relation, you are limited to identity over primitives and cut, the context differentiating version thereof. But what about non-transitive or non-reflexive calculi? Well, remember, in principle we said we are pluralists about a minimal derivability relation, so we're not tied to explicating, using for a measurement the minimal derivability relation consisting of cut and identity. All we claim is that it's an adaptive choice for some pragmatic desideratas, such as looking at the meaning interrelations in the LK family of logics, and for that it seems quite adaptive. Furthermore, it's easy to accommodate non-transitive calculi in our semantics. After all, what we need to do is prove conservativity, and we do this via the subformula property. Now, the subformula property is, generally speaking, easier to prove without the presence of cut, so without the presence of transitivity. Now, in the case of non-reflexive calculi, things aren't quite as simple. However, many, maybe even most of the non-reflexive calculi do still use identity, do still use an identity axiom, such as LPC or TLID. For others that don't use identity, another choice might be a bit more suitable. But in those calculi that do use identity, you might have a global failure of reflexivity, but you still have local reflexivity available on the level of the inference using the identity axiom. Now, all we need to build our inference behavior semantics is to work with this local notion of reflexivity. We don't need global reflexivity. This is irrelevant for our minimal derivability relation. Now let's close with a little summary of everything we've seen. Inference behavior is a fresh way of doing proof-theoretic semantics. It takes very seriously the literature from logical pluralism. It's very much substructurally informed, and it takes into account Wittgensteinian meaning as use inferentialism just as much as Gentzen's molecularism, i.e. considering the connective rules, the definitions of the proof rules. Inference behavior semantics gives us a tool to identify all of the parameters of the proof rules that determine the use of connectives. We measure meaning dynamically based on the actual inferences we make, and not just by stipulating some principles top-down that tell us what the meaning of the connective is. So we arrive at meaning bottom-up by means of measurement rather than top-down by means of stipulation, which might be an epistemic advantage. And finally, and maybe most importantly, we've shown how to practically implement inference behavior semantics by giving semantics for all connectives in two-dimensional sequent calculi. And this way, we've been able to make sense. We've told a semantic story about the additive multiplicative distinction, and we provided a purely semantic explanation for the codetermination effects that Bogdan Dicher and others recently observed in the literature on logical pluralism. Now, I believe there is a lot to be won from doing inference behavior semantics, and I hope that you agree that further research into inference behavior semantics can prove a valuable addition to the proof-theoretic semantics toolbox and the proof-theoretic semantic universe. Thank you so much for listening through this recorded talk. Just showing you some references in case you want to stop and screenshot. Grand. Thank you so much.